I stood at the altar in my grandmother's lace dress when I saw my cousin Nina slip something into the wedding cake, her eyes locked with my fiancé's. They thought I wouldn't notice, but I've always been watching. When I collapsed minutes later, gasps filled the church. Then the real shock came. My father, wheelchair-bound for 9 years, stood up and walked to my side. They never knew he'd been secretly healing, just as they never knew I'd already discovered their plan to take my inheritance once I said, I do. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. So here's the thing about perfect weddings, they're just elaborate stage sets. The designer boutonnières, the hand-painted place cards, the $4,000 cake with edible gold leaf, all just props for a performance no one bothers questioning. My wedding day had been meticulously planned for 14 months. The venue, a historic stone church nestled in the hills of Vermont, had a 6-month waiting list that my mother had somehow charmed her way past. The flowers were white peonies, flown in from Ecuador despite being out of season. The string quartet played Pachelbel while rehearsing, but promised contemporary arrangements for the actual ceremony. Everything perfect, everything controlled, everything a lie. I remember how the morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the altar where Xavier waited, his smile practiced, his eyes calculating. Nina, my maid of honor and cousin, hovered nearby, adjusting my train with hands that trembled slightly. Not from emotion, from anticipation. I'd known Nina since we were toddlers sharing bubble baths and building blanket forts. She'd been the one who held my hair back during my first hangover in college, the shoulder I cried on when my father's accident left him paralyzed from the waist down. At least that's what everyone believed. You look stunning, Eliza, she whispered. Her voice honey-sweet as she fixed my veil. A real Callaway bride. The Callaway name. That's what this was really about. Not love, not family bonds, but the fortune my grandfather had built and my father had protected, the inheritance that would transfer partially to my husband upon marriage, thanks to an outdated clause in the family trust. A clause Xavier had discovered during a late-night session at the family attorney's office, where he worked as a paralegal before rapidly ascending to my fiancé. I smiled at Nina, watched her hands as they fluttered near my face, pretending to adjust a stray hair. Everything looks perfect, I said. The cake especially. Her hands paused, just for a millisecond. The baker outdid herself. Yes, the cake. 5 tiers of vanilla bean and raspberry, decorated with sugar flowers that matched my bouquet. The cake I'd watched Nina approach just 30 minutes earlier, when she thought everyone was busy with photographs. I'd excused myself to the bathroom, but instead slipped into the reception hall just in time to see her sprinkle something onto the slice marked for the bride. Behind us, my mother fussed with the flower girl's basket. My father sat in his wheelchair, stoic and handsome in his tuxedo, silver hair combed back, hands folded neatly in his lap. 9 years in that chair after a riding accident that shattered his spine. 9 years of Xavier slowly integrating himself into our lives, first as my father's physical therapist, then as a family friend, finally as the man who proposed with my grandmother's diamond. 10 minutes, the wedding coordinator announced, popping her head through the chapel doors. I nodded, my heart steady. Most brides would be fluttering with nerves, but I felt strangely calm. I turned to my father. Ready, Dad? He looked up at me, his blue eyes, so like mine, clear and sharp. More than you know, sweetheart. The truth was, I'd known something was wrong for months. It started with whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Strange calls on Xavier's phone from Nina that he'd dismiss as wedding details. Money transfers from my personal accounts that Xavier insisted were normal pre-wedding expenses. But it was the document I found in Xavier's desk drawer 3 weeks ago that confirmed everything, a copy of my medical insurance policy with death benefits highlighted, alongside notes about untraceable compounds and symptoms resembling allergic reactions. That's when I called my father's old friend, Detective Marcus Rivera. The man who'd investigated the suspicious circumstances around my grandfather's death years ago, the death that had left my father in control of the Callaway Enterprises. The man who had quietly been helping my father with his own suspicions for longer than I knew. The wedding march began, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and I stood poised at the entrance, my father's wheelchair beside me. The guests rose, smiling, cameras flashing. Xavier waited at the altar, handsome in his tailored suit, Nina standing opposite with my other bridesmaids. To everyone watching, it was a fairy tale, the devoted fiancé, the loving cousin, the beautiful bride. My father looked up at me one last time before we began our journey down the aisle. He squeezed my hand 3 times, our secret code since childhood. I'm with you. With each step, I remembered the night I discovered the truth. I'd been looking for a phone charger in Xavier's office when I found the burner phone tucked behind his degrees on the bookshelf. The text messages between him and Nina went back 2 years, long before he'd even proposed. Photographs of documents from my father's study. Screenshots of bank statements. Lists of my allergies and medications. She'll never suspect a thing. One message read. Her father's too busy playing cripple to notice what's happening right in front of him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Playing cripple. Those words had made my blood run cold. Because by then, I'd already begun to suspect something even more shocking about my father's condition. We reached the halfway point of the aisle. I could see Xavier's face more clearly now, the slight sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning, the way his eyes darted between Nina and the cake displayed prominently at the reception entrance, visible through the side doors. 2 weeks ago, I'd installed tiny cameras throughout the house, one in Xavier's office, one in the guest room where Nina had been staying to help with wedding preparations, and one in my father's private study. What they captured changed everything. My father, rising from his wheelchair when he thought the house was empty, carefully exercising legs that were supposedly useless. Xavier and Nina, locked in an embrace that no fiancé and cousin should share, whispering about just a few more days and, once we're married, the trust fund triggers. My father, speaking in hushed tones to Detective Rivera about evidence nearly compiled, about protection orders ready to file, about his suspicions that his own accident 9 years ago had been anything but. We reached the altar. Xavier extended his hand to me, smile brilliant, eyes calculating. "You look beautiful," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Thank you," I replied, voice steady. "I feel like I might faint from all the excitement." His eyes widened slightly, pleased. Nina shifted beside us, her bouquet trembling in her grip. The minister began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved." I let my mind drift to the meeting I'd had with Detective Rivera yesterday, in a coffee shop 3 towns over where no one would recognize us. The lab results from the sample I'd collected after following Nina to an unmarked building on the outskirts of town. The paperwork already filed with the courts. The officers stationed discreetly among the wedding guests, dressed in formal wear with badges and handcuffs hidden beneath rented tuxedo jackets. "Xavier James Porter, do you take Elizabeth and Calloway to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Xavier squeezed my hands, his eyes never leaving mine. "I do," he said, voice ringing with false sincerity. "And do you, Elizabeth and Calloway, take Xavier James Porter to be your lawfully wedded husband?" I took a deep breath. This was it. My knees buckled. Not from any drug, but from careful timing. I collapsed forward, eyes rolling back. My body going limp in Xavier's arms exactly as we'd planned. Gasps erupted from the guests. Someone screamed. Xavier lowered me to the ground, his acting surprisingly convincing as he called for help, for water, for someone to call an ambulance. "She needs cake sugar," Nina cried out, right on cue. "Quick, give her a bite of the wedding cake." My mother rushed forward, but it was my father who created the true distraction. With strength and steadiness that shocked the entire assembly, he pushed himself up from his wheelchair. 9 years of secret physical therapy, of playing the part while gathering evidence, of letting Xavier and Nina believe he was helpless, all revealed in one powerful moment as he stood to his full height and stepped forward. "Get away from my daughter," he commanded, voice thundering through the chapel. The silence that followed was absolute. Xavier's face drained of color. Nina dropped her bouquet, orchids scattering across the altar steps. I opened my eyes, sat up slowly, and smiled at them both. Surprise. Detective Rivera stepped forward from the second row, no longer disguised as just another guest. 2 uniformed officers emerged from side doors. "Xavier Porter, Nina Calloway, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted poisoning, and fraud." Xavier tried to run. He made it 3 steps before an officer tackled him to the ground, the wedding guests shrieking and scrambling. "Out of the way." Nina didn't move, just stood frozen, staring at my father as if seeing a ghost. "You were never paralyzed," she whispered. My father straightened his tie, the movement casual, practiced. "No, I wasn't. Not after the first year. But you and Xavier were so convinced of your own brilliance, so certain I was broken and helpless, that you never bothered to check. You never noticed the subtle changes in muscle tone, the way I maneuvered the chair with just a little too much ease. You were too busy planning your next betrayal." As the officers led them away, reading rights over the murmurs and gasps of shocked guests, I stood beside my father, his arm around my shoulders for the first time in nearly a decade. "I'm sorry you didn't get a real wedding," he said quietly. I looked around at the beautiful chaos, the flowers, the candles, the stunned faces, the abandoned wedding cake that would be entered as evidence. This was never about a wedding, Dad. It was about justice. My mother approached, tears streaming down her face as she embraced my father. She had known the truth for only 2 days, sworn to secrecy until this moment. The weight of it showed. In her eyes, in the tremble of her hands as she touched my father's face, confirming he was really standing. All this time, she whispered. He nodded. I had to be sure. After my accident, when I started to regain feeling but the attempts on the company continued, I knew someone close to us was responsible. I couldn't risk them trying again, with more permanent methods. The guests were being asked to remain. For statements, the cake carefully removed by officers wearing gloves, the beautiful reception hall transformed into an impromptu crime scene. My white dress felt suddenly heavy, the symbolism of purity and new beginnings twisted into something unrecognizable. One of the detectives approached with an evidence bag containing a small vial. Found this in the maid of honor's purse. Lab will confirm, but it appears to be a powerful sedative combined with compounds that could trigger a heart attack in someone with your specific medical profile. I nodded, unsurprised. They researched thoroughly. Not thoroughly enough. My father said. They never looked into why I insisted on the same physician for all these years, or why I requested my medical records remain paper only, no digital copies. The truth was both simpler and more complex than anyone knew. After my father's accident, when he began to regain sensation contrary to his doctor's predictions, he had confided only in Dr. Winters, his college roommate and trusted friend. Together, they documented his recovery in a separate set of records, while maintaining the paralysis diagnosis publicly. When financial irregularities began appearing in the family business, my father's suspicions grew. Rather than reveal his improved condition, he used it as an advantage, watching, listening, gathering evidence while appearing helpless. Xavier had been hired as a physical therapist 3 years into the charade, not by coincidence, we now knew, but as part of a long game orchestrated by Nina, who had always resented my position as heir to the Calloway fortune. How did you know? A voice asked. I turned to find Aunt Patricia, Nina's mother, standing pale and shaken near the altar. About Nina and Xavier? Or about the plan to kill me at my own wedding? She flinched. Any of it. All of it. I looked at my father, who nodded slightly, giving me permission to explain. It started with inconsistencies, I said. Xavier claimed to love classic films, but never recognized quotations from the very movies he claimed were his favorites. Nina suddenly became interested in my medical history, asking questions about allergies and reactions. Money disappeared from accounts. Xavier had access to small amounts, but a pattern. What I didn't say was how I'd woken one night to find Xavier in my home office, photographing documents. How I'd pretended to be asleep while installing tracking software on his laptop the next day. How I discovered the truth about my father. By accidentally walking into his room without knocking, finding him standing by the window when he should have been unable to support his own weight. The confrontation that followed had been quiet, intense, my shock and anger meeting his grim determination. He made me understand the stakes, showed me evidence of other accidents befalling Calloway executives over the years. Made me see that our enemies were closer than I'd ever imagined. Why go through with the wedding? Aunt Patricia asked, her voice hollow. Why not just report them? My father answered this time. Because suspicion isn't proof. We needed them to act, to show their hand completely. What followed was a blur of statements, evidence collection, and shocked conversations. Guests were eventually allowed to leave, though many stayed, too stunned or curious to depart. The caterers were instructed to serve the food, minus the cake, in the reception hall, turning the aftermath into a surreal gathering that was part crime scene, part family reunion. I changed out of my wedding dress, grateful to remove the weight of it along with the persona I'd been maintaining for months. In a side room of the church, Detective Rivera showed us the preliminary results from the field test of the cake sample. Scopolamine primarily, mixed with something else we'll need the lab to identify. Enough to cause disorientation, memory loss, and potential cardiac issues. With your documented heart murmur, it could have been fatal. My father's hand tightened on my shoulder, and easily dismissed as wedding day stress triggering a pre-existing condition. Precisely, Rivera nodded. The trust would have transferred, medical examiners would have found a natural cause, and your daughter's new husband would have been a very wealthy widower. What no one else knew was how close I had come to not discovering the plot at all. If I hadn't forgotten my phone charger that night, if I hadn't needed to use Xavier's office, if I hadn't knocked his carefully arranged bookshelf while searching for an outlet. The burner phone might never have fallen into view, and I might now be fighting for my life instead of watching my would-be murderers being driven away in police cars. As evening fell, the last of the wedding guests departed. My parents and I Stood in the empty church, the flowers already wilting, the candles burned low. "I still can't believe you kept this from me for so long," my mother said to my father, her voice a mixture of hurt and admiration. "I couldn't risk it," he replied. Simply. "Not until we were sure who was involved." "And now?" I asked. "What happens now?" My father looked older in that moment, the weight of his long deception visible in the lines of his face. "Now we rebuild. We identify everyone involved in this conspiracy and remove them from our lives and the company. We heal." I nodded, thinking. About trust betrayed and reforged, about the facades we maintain and the truths we hide. And we remember to look more carefully at the people closest to us. That night, in the safety of our family home, swept for devices and guarded by security, I sat with my parents in the library, the same room where countless family celebrations had taken place. The same room where Xavier had proposed. The same room where, unknown to him, my father had often exercised his supposedly useless legs when the house was empty. "Why did you choose today?" my mother asked. "Why not stop the wedding before it began?" My father and I exchanged glances. "We needed witnesses," I explained. "Dozens of them. People who could testify to what they saw, what they heard. And we needed them to reveal their full plan, not just parts of it." What I didn't add was the satisfaction of turning their performance back on them. The poetic justice of collapsing at the altar not from their poison, but from my own choice. The power of my father rising from a wheelchair they believed had confined him for 9 years. "Some people might call it cruel," my mother mused. "Letting them believe they were succeeding until the last possible moment." "Crueler than planning to murder your cousin at her wedding?" I asked. "Crueler than attempting to steal a family legacy through death and deception?" She had no answer for that. Later, alone in my childhood bedroom, I opened my laptop and began typing. Not a statement for the police, I'd already provided that. Not a press release, though the media would certainly come calling soon enough. Instead, I began documenting everything, from the first suspicions to today's dramatic conclusion. The truth needed to be recorded, preserved in my own words before others could twist it. Because here's what I've learned about betrayal: it doesn't arrive announced with villainous laughter. It creeps in through trusted hands adjusting your veil, through the lips that kiss you goodnight, through the cousin who's known you since childhood. It hides behind concerns about your health, behind generous offers to manage your finances, behind sympathetic smiles when you're struggling. And here's what I've learned about strength: sometimes it looks like weakness. Sometimes it's the patience to watch and wait while gathering evidence. Sometimes it's pretending not to see the truth while preparing to confront it. Sometimes it's a father sitting in a wheelchair he doesn't need, enduring pitying glances and limited mobility, all to protect his family from enemies they don't yet recognize. The moon rose high outside my window as I typed the final words of this first chapter. Tomorrow would bring questions, investigations, legal proceedings. The Calloway name would be in headlines for all the wrong reasons. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel something unexpected amid the wreckage of betrayal: pride. Pride in my father's sacrifice and foresight. Pride in our careful dismantling of a plot years in the making. Pride in standing my ground when it would have been easier to run. Have you ever discovered that the people you trusted most were orchestrating your downfall? Did you confront them immediately, or did you watch and wait, gathering evidence for the perfect moment? Share your story in the comments below. The morning after my almost wedding dawned with a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. The weight of deception had been so constant that its absence felt like floating. I made coffee in my parents' kitchen, watching the early light filter through maple trees that had witnessed my entire childhood. My phone buzzed incessantly: friends, distant relatives, reporters, all wanting the inside story of the Calloway wedding disaster. I ignored them all. Some stories need time to breathe before they're shared. Detective Rivera arrived just after 8, his unmarked car pulling into our circular driveway with a soft crunch of gravel. My father greeted him in the foyer, standing tall, no wheelchair in sight. Even after yesterday's revelation, seeing him upright still sent a small shock through my system. 9 years of muscle memory doesn't disappear overnight. The lab confirmed what we suspected, Rivera said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. The cake contained a complex mixture of scopolamine, digitalis, and something called thallium. With your heart condition, Eliza, it would have appeared as cardiac arrest. And easily written off as stress-induced, my father added, his voice tight. Precisely. Rivera placed a folder on the table. Xavier and Nina have been formally charged. But there's more. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, absorbing its warmth. They weren't working alone. Rivera's eyebrows raised slightly. How did you know? The truth was, I'd suspected for weeks. The complexity, the financing, the specialized knowledge of chemicals, it all pointed to a larger operation. The money trail, I said simply. Xavier's position as a paralegal doesn't pay enough for the equipment I found, and Nina's art gallery is barely breaking even. Someone's been funding them. My father nodded, unsurprised. He'd been investigating financial irregularities in the family business for years, first from his wheelchair, then under the guise of physical therapy appointments that were actually meetings with private investigators. We found this in Nina's apartment. Rivera slid a photograph across the table. A document with the letterhead of Westridge Pharmaceuticals, a competing company that had tried to acquire Callaway Biotech 3 times in the past decade. It appears Westridge has been orchestrating a long-term plan to gain control of your family's company, using Xavier and Nina as pawns. My mother entered the kitchen, her face drawn from a sleepless night. She glanced at the document, then turned away. "I've invited Nina's parents for lunch," she announced quietly. "They deserve to hear everything directly from us." I felt a flicker of resistance. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard had always favored Nina, had always pushed her into my orbit. Since childhood. Had they known? Had they suspected? Or were they as deceived as I had been? "Are you sure that's wise?" my father asked, echoing my thoughts. "They've lost their daughter to prison," my mother replied. "We won't lose our humanity along with everything else." That was my mother, finding compassion where I could only see betrayal. Perhaps that's why my father had protected her from the truth for so long. Some people's strength lies in their ability to see the best in others. To reveal the worst would be to dim that light. Rivera left with a promise to return the next day. We had a dozen more statements to complete, evidence to review, a case to build that would ensure Xavier and Nina remained in custody without bail. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in the Callaway household, they were grinding with particular purpose. I retreated to my father's study, the room that had once been command central for his secret investigation. For years, he'd maintained 2 sets of files, the ones visible to anyone who entered, and the ones hidden behind a false panel in the bookcase. Now, with the deception exposed, both sets lay open on his desk. "I should have told you sooner," he said from the doorway, watching me flip through photographs of Xavier meeting with Westridge executives. But I couldn't be certain how deep this went. "You didn't trust me?" The question escaped before I could stop it, carrying more hurt than I intended. My father crossed to the window, his movements still slightly stiff from years of limited mobility. "I didn't trust that they weren't watching you. The less you knew, the more natural your reactions would be." I thought back to the months of pretending, of smiling at Xavier across the dinner table while knowing he'd been photographing my personal documents. Of hugging Nina at bridal fittings while aware she'd been researching untraceable poisons. "It was killing me to keep you in the dark," my father continued. "Every time you looked at that man with real affection, I wanted to tear him apart with my bare hands." "When did you know? About Xavier specifically?" My father sighed, turning back to face me. "I had suspicions from the beginning. His arrival was too convenient, his background too perfect. But concrete evidence? That came the night of your engagement party. I remembered that night well, champagne flowing, congratulations all around, Xavier charming every Callaway relative with practiced ease. What I hadn't known was that while guests celebrated in our home, my father had used the opportunity to search Xavier's car. Inside a hidden compartment beneath the spare tire, he'd found a burner phone, fake identification, and a small vial of clear liquid. I photographed everything, put it back exactly as I found it, then had my contact at the police lab analyze a swab from the vial. He tapped a folder labeled with that date. "Digitalis. The same compound found in your wedding cake." The realization hit me like ice water. He was planning this from the very beginning. Before the beginning, my father corrected. "We now believe Xavier was specifically placed in my rehabilitation center after my accident. They planned years ahead, Eliza." The scope of the deception staggered me. How many seemingly random events had been carefully orchestrated moves in this game? My meeting Xavier at the rehabilitation center while visiting my father. Nina's sudden interest in reconnecting after years of distant politeness. The convenient opening at the law firm where Xavier landed a position that gave him access to Callaway legal documents. But why? I asked. Why such an elaborate plan? Corporate espionage usually involves hacking or bribing insiders, not. I gestured vaguely, unable to find words for the personal violation of it all. Because of the trust structure, my father explained. Your grandfather was old-fashioned and more than a little paranoid. The Callaway family trust can only be controlled by blood relatives or their spouses. If something happened to me, control would pass to you. If something happened to you after marriage, it would go to Xavier. The pieces aligned with terrible clarity. And he would sell controlling interest to Westridge. Exactly. Conventional corporate espionage couldn't crack the Callaway trust. They needed someone on the inside, related By blood or marriage? A chill ran through me as I processed the calculated nature of it all. And my heart condition made me the perfect target. A known medical issue that could explain a sudden death. My father nodded grimly. The condition that kept you from the competitive swimming you loved, that made teachers treat you carefully in school, they weaponized it against you. I remembered the day I was diagnosed at 12 years old. The tests, the monitors, the serious faces of doctors explaining that while not immediately life-threatening, my condition meant certain restrictions. No extreme sports. Careful monitoring during physical exertion. Regular checkups and medication that I'd likely take for life. A condition that had shaped my childhood had nearly become the perfect murder weapon. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. From the window, I could see Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard standing on the porch, both looking decades older than they had at yesterday's ceremony. "Are you ready for this?" my father asked quietly. I wasn't. But sometimes readiness is a luxury we don't get. Sometimes we must face the hardest conversations without preparation, armed only with truth. Lunch was a painfully quiet affair. My mother had prepared a simple meal, but nobody ate much. Aunt Patricia's hands trembled as she lifted her water glass. Uncle Richard stared at my father with a mixture of disbelief and anger. 9 years, he finally said, breaking the silence. 9 years of family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, all while you could walk? All a pretense? My father met his gaze steadily. Yes. Why? What possible reason? Because someone tried to kill me, Richard. The riding accident wasn't an accident. And when I began to recover feeling and mobility contrary to medical expectations, I realized I had an advantage. People speak freely in front of those they believe are helpless. Aunt Patricia made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. And you think Nina was part of that? That she tried to kill you 9 years ago? No, I interjected. Nina was just 17 then. But we believe she was recruited later. When the original plan failed. Recruited? Uncle Richard's voice rose. By whom? For what? This sounds paranoid, James. Like you've constructed some elaborate conspiracy to explain. Westridge Pharmaceuticals, my mother said quietly. The company that's been trying to acquire Callaway Biotech for the past decade. The company where your brother works, Richard. The color drained from Uncle Richard's face. His brother, Martin, was a research director at Westridge, a connection we'd always viewed as an awkward family footnote, nothing more. Now it took on darker implications. That's ridiculous, he sputtered. Martin would never, we have documentation. My father said, not unkindly. Financial transfers, meeting records, communications. Nina was approached 3 years ago, shortly after she graduated with her chemistry degree. They used her resentment of the Callaway wealth, her feeling of being second best to Eliza, her relationship with you and your connection to Martin. Aunt Patricia's shoulders slumped, defeat written in every line of her body. The money for the gallery, she whispered. We thought it was a grant. Martin helped her apply. She looked up, eyes swimming with tears. We didn't know. You have to believe we didn't know. I studied my aunt and uncle, these people who had been fixtures at every Callaway family gathering, who had cheered at my graduations, who had sent care packages during college finals. Had they been unwitting pawns too? Or had they suspected something and chosen to look away? The investigation is ongoing, my father said carefully. Detective Rivera will want to speak with you both. Your cooperation could help Nina. Help her how? Uncle Richard demanded. She tried to poison her own cousin. Reduced charges, potentially, my father replied. Depending on what you know, what you can verify about how she was recruited. The conversation continued in painful circles. Denial, anger, bargaining, my aunt and uncle cycling through grief for the daughter they thought they knew. I excused myself after an hour, unable to bear the weight of their sorrow alongside my own. In my childhood bedroom, I pulled out the journal I'd kept since finding the first evidence of Xavier's betrayal. Each entry documented another discovery, another piece of the puzzle, dates, times, observations recorded with careful precision. It would become part of the case file, but for now, it served as my anchor to reality when everything else seemed to be shifting beneath my feet. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Rivera, news conference tomorrow at 10 a.m. Department wants statement from family. Prepare? I hadn't considered the public aspect of all this. The Callaway name carried weight in Vermont, our biotech company employed hundreds, our charitable foundation supported local hospitals and schools. This scandal wouldn't remain private for long. Eliza? My mother stood in the doorway, looking exhausted. They're gone. Your father is speaking with the security team. I nodded, unsure what to say. What comfort could I offer when her sister-in-law's daughter had tried to murder her only child? She crossed the room and sat beside me on the bed, just as she had when I was young and frightened by thunderstorms or bad dreams. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, she said softly. All the times Nina seemed jealous or Xavier seemed too perfect. Was I blind? Or did I just not want to see? They fooled everyone, Mom. I covered her hand with mine. That was their job. Not everyone, she corrected. Not your father. Not you, eventually. She sighed, looking around at the bedroom that still held remnants of my teenage years, swimming trophies from before my diagnosis, photographs of friends from boarding school, books lining every available surface. I've always been proud of your intelligence, your determination. But your compassion worried me sometimes. I feared people would take advantage. I thought of Xavier's practiced charm, of how perfectly he'd played the role of devoted fiancé. They did take advantage. Yes, but you found your way back to the truth. That's the difference between being kind and being naive. The kind person sees the best in others but recognizes when that faith has been misplaced. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything still settling around us like dust after an explosion. There's going to be a press conference. Tomorrow, I finally said. The police want us to make a statement. My mother nodded, unsurprised. Your father expected as much. We should present a united front. She paused, studying my face. Unless you'd prefer to stay out of the spotlight. No one would blame you. The thought was tempting, to hide away, to process everything privately, to let my parents handle the public fallout. But that wouldn't be true to who I was, or to who I was becoming through this crucible of betrayal and truth. I'll be there, I said. I need to speak for myself. I thought you might say that. She smiled faintly. You've always faced things head-on, even as a child. Remember when you insisted on telling the neighbors yourself that you'd accidentally broken their window with your baseball? I laughed despite everything. I was terrified, but somehow facing them seemed better than hiding. Some things don't change. She stood, smoothing her skirt. Get some rest if you can. Tomorrow will be difficult in different ways. After she left, I returned to my journal, adding today's developments in the same careful handwriting. The conversation with Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard. The confirmation of Westridge's involvement. The planned press conference. Writing helped order my thoughts, transform chaotic emotions into logical sequences I could examine and understand. On the last page, I began a new entry, different from the others. Not evidence or observations, but questions I couldn't yet answer. How do you rebuild trust after discovering the depth of betrayal? How do you distinguish between healthy caution and paralyzing suspicion? How do you move forward when looking back is the only way to make sense of your present? The answers wouldn't come tonight. Perhaps they wouldn't come for months or years. But asking the questions felt like the first step toward finding a path through the wreckage. Outside my window, security guards patrolled the perimeter of our property. My father had hired them immediately after yesterday's arrests, concerned about potential retaliation from Westridge or other conspirators we hadn't yet identified. Another reminder that while the immediate threat had been neutralized, the larger danger might still be unfolding. I thought about the press conference tomorrow, about facing cameras and questions, about putting words to an experience still raw and unprocessed. What would I say? How could I explain something I was still struggling to understand myself? The simplest truth seemed best. Yes, my fiancé and cousin had conspired to murder me for financial gain. Yes, my father had feigned paralysis for years while gathering evidence. Yes, the Calloway family had been targeted by corporate interests, willing to use any means necessary to acquire our company. But there were deeper truths too, ones harder to articulate for news soundbites. How betrayal by those closest to you reshapes your understanding of trust. How discovering deception makes you question every memory, reinterpret every interaction through a new, darker lens. How survival sometimes requires its own kind of deception. My phone buzzed again, an email notification. The subject line read, "Interview request, exclusive with the bride who survived." I deleted it without opening. Vultures were already circling, eager to transform our trauma into entertainment. I closed my journal and moved to the window, watching darkness settle over the grounds. Somewhere in the state correctional facility, Xavier and Nina were spending their first night in custody. Were they regretful? Angry at being caught? Or simply calculating their next move? In the hallway, I could hear my parents talking in low voices, the cadence of their conversation familiar and somehow comforting despite everything. They had weathered their own storm of secrets and necessary lies, yet their connection remained intact. Perhaps that was the model I needed, not blind trust, but resilient faith tested by fire. I changed into pajamas and slipped between the cool sheets of my childhood bed, exhaustion finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had carried me through the past 2 days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the press conference, further questioning, the beginning of what would likely be a long legal process. But tonight, in this moment, I allowed myself to acknowledge a truth I'd been avoiding. Despite everything, I had loved Xavier. Or rather, I had loved the person I believed him to be, the attentive partner, the ambitious professional, the man who seemed to see and appreciate the real me. That person had never existed, but my feelings for him had been real. And now I had to grieve not only the betrayal, but the loss of someone who had never truly been mine to lose. With that thought came not tears, but a strange, calm clarity. The heart is resilient, even one with a medical condition. It can be fooled, it can be broken, but it cannot be permanently destroyed by deception. In time, it finds its rhythm again. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my narrative from those who sought to end it. Tonight, I would rest, gathering strength for the battle still to come. Have you ever had to rebuild after betrayal? How did you find the strength to trust again, knowing how thoroughly you'd been deceived? The journey from victim to survivor isn't a straight line, it spirals back on itself, encounters unexpected obstacles, sometimes seems impossible to navigate. But each step forward, however small, is an act of reclamation. The press conference was a storm of flashing cameras and shouted questions. I stood between my parents at the polished podium, my father's hand steady on my shoulder, a gesture that would have been impossible during his years of pretended paralysis. The symbolism wasn't lost on the journalists who packed the room, their hungry eyes capturing every detail for tomorrow's headlines. The Calloway family wishes to thank law enforcement for their swift action, my father began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had led boardroom meetings for decades. What began as a joyous family celebration became the culmination of a long-term criminal conspiracy. I watched the reporters scribbling notes, digital recorders held high. In the front row, a young woman with sharp eyes and a sharper pencil sketched my family with quick, deft strokes. Not a photographer, an illustrator for one of the national magazines. We were becoming a story, a narrative, something separate from ourselves. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped forward, the microphone suddenly looming large. I had prepared remarks, carefully written and reviewed by both the family attorney and Detective Rivera. Safe words. Measured words. But standing there, feeling the weight of all those eyes, I set the paper aside. 2 days ago, I was supposed to marry a man I thought I knew, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Instead, I discovered the power of seeing clearly. My fiancé and my cousin attempted to poison me at my own wedding. They didn't act alone. This was a corporate conspiracy aimed at gaining control of Callaway Biotech through murder and fraud. A ripple moved through the room. This was more direct than the careful statement they'd expected. I'm here today not as a victim, but as a witness. I witnessed betrayal from those I trusted most. I witnessed my father stand from a wheelchair. He'd used as both shield and observatory for 9 years. I witnessed the exposure of a plot that would have ended my life for financial gain. I paused, making eye contact with several reporters. The details of this case will unfold through proper legal channels. But I want to be clear about one thing, this was not a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was calculated, corporate-sponsored attempted murder, and we intend to pursue justice to its fullest extent. Questions erupted immediately. I fielded them with as much composure as possible, deflecting the more sensational inquiries, clarifying facts where needed. No, I had not ingested any poison. Yes, my father had maintained a deliberate deception about his recovery. No, we would not be releasing photos of the evidence at this time. Miss Calloway, called a voice from the back, how could you not know? Your fiancé was deceiving you? Were there no warning signs? The question landed like a slap. Of course there had been signs I'd rationalized, dismissed, or simply failed to see until it was almost too late. I felt my mother tense beside me, ready to intervene, but I raised my hand slightly to stop her. The most dangerous deceptions, I replied carefully, are the ones wrapped in what we want to believe. Xavier presented himself as everything I thought I was looking for. The warning signs were there, but they were subtle, inconsistencies in stories, unexplained absences, small financial discrepancies. By the time I recognized the pattern, I was already deep into planning a wedding that would have ended my life. My honesty seemed to quiet the room momentarily. Then a different reporter stood, her question directed at my father. Mr. Calloway, you maintained the pretense of paralysis for 9 years. During that time, you allowed your daughter to become involved with a man you suspected of criminal intent. How do you justify putting her at risk? My father's face remained impassive, but I felt the slight tremble in his hand on my shoulder. I carry that weight every day, he answered, his voice lower. When I began to recover from my accident, an accident we now know was deliberately orchestrated, I faced an impossible choice. Reveal my recovery and alert those who had tried to kill me, or maintain the deception while gathering evidence to expose the entire network. I chose the latter, believing it would ultimately provide greater protection for my family. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. When Xavier entered our lives, I had suspicions but no proof. By the time I obtained concrete evidence, Eliza had already formed an attachment. At that point, warning her without proof would have seemed like the overprotective reaction of a father who disapproved of her choice. Instead, I increased surveillance and accelerated my investigation. So you used your daughter as bait? The reporter pressed. That's enough. Detective Rivera stepped forward from where he'd been standing at the side of the room. This press conference is to provide factual information about the arrests, not to interrogate victims of a serious crime. The Callaways have cooperated fully with law enforcement and have shown remarkable courage throughout this ordeal. The conference concluded shortly after, Rivera skillfully steering the questioning back to the facts of the case rather than the emotional undercurrents. As we exited through a side door to avoid the crush of additional questions, I caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd, Mara Chen, my roommate from college, now a financial journalist for one of the business monthlies. She gave me a small nod, her expression a mixture of professional interest and personal concern. In the car driving home, my mother broke the tense silence. That reporter was out of line. She asked what many will be thinking, my father replied, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Why I let Eliza get so close to danger? You didn't let anything happen, I said quietly. I made my own choices. Based on incomplete information that I withheld, he countered. Would I have believed you? Without proof? If you told me Xavier was targeting me for the trust fund? I turned in my seat to face him directly. Or would I have written it off as paranoia from a man traumatized by his accident? My father didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried the weight of years of second-guessing. I don't know. That uncertainty haunted me every day, whether telling you would protect you or push you closer to him in defiance. The past can't be changed, my mother interjected, practical as always. What matters now is moving forward. The press conference is done. The initial story is out. Now we focus on the case and on healing. Healing. Such a simple word for such a complex process. How does one heal from betrayal so intimate it rewrites your personal history? How do you trust your own judgment again after discovering how thoroughly it failed you? Back at home, I retreated to the solarium, a glass-enclosed room at the back of the house where orchids bloomed under my mother's careful attention. The space had always been my thinking spot, somewhere between indoors and out, protected yet open to light. My phone buzzed with a text from Mara. I saw the press conference. You were incredible. Coffee tomorrow? No journalist hat, just friend hat. Promise. I stared at the message, weighing the offer. Mara and I had drifted apart. After college, our careers taking us in different directions. She knew Xavier only through the occasional social media update or holiday card. Would reconnecting now seem opportunistic on her part? Or was it a genuine extension of friendship when I needed it most? Trust your instincts, a voice said from the doorway. My father stood there, changed from his press conference suit into more casual clothes, looking more like himself than he had in years. My instincts haven't exactly proven reliable lately, I replied, gesturing to my phone. He crossed the room and sat in the wicker chair opposite mine. Your instincts were fine. You were working with flawed information. There's a difference. Is there? Sometimes I wonder if I ignored red flags because Xavier was so. I searched for the right word. Perfect, my father supplied. Too perfect. That was by design, Eliza. They studied you, learned what you valued, what you were looking for, and created exactly that person. The thought made my skin crawl. How many conversations had been strategic rather than sincere? How many of Xavier's preferences and opinions had been carefully crafted to align with mine? That text is from Mara, I said, changing the subject slightly. She wants to meet for coffee. As a friend, she says, not a journalist. Do you want to see her? I considered the question honestly. I think so. She knew me before Xavier. Before all of this. Maybe talking to someone from that time would help. My father nodded. Then trust that feeling. Not every connection is a threat, Eliza. Isolation is what they want. People are easier to manipulate when they're alone. Like you were? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Alone with your secret for 9 years? A shadow crossed his face. Yes. Exactly like that. It nearly broke me, at times. Don't make the same mistake. The admission surprised me. My father had always seemed invulnerable, a stone tower of certainty even from his wheelchair. To hear him acknowledge weakness, vulnerability, it shifted something in my perception of him, made him more human. I watched you date other men before Xavier, he continued, his voice softer now. Good men, some of them. But none perfect. Xavier studied those relationships, noted what was missing, and became the missing pieces. The attentiveness Thomas lacked. The ambition Jake didn't have. The cultural interests Sam couldn't share. I flinched at the names, memories of relationships that had ended for ordinary, human reasons. Nothing dramatic, just the slow recognition of incompatibility. How do you know that? We found his notes. In a storage unit rented under a false name. Detailed observations about your preferences, your past relationships, psychological assessments provided by Nina. My stomach churned. Nina was analyzing me? All those heart-to-heart conversations, all those secrets shared. Being weaponized, yes. My father's directness was painful but necessary. Your cousin has a minor in psychology alongside her chemistry degree. She used that knowledge to help Xavier create the perfect persona to attract you. I closed my eyes, memories reshuffling themselves with this new information. Nina asking about my dating history during wine nights. Nina suggesting I try therapy after a particularly difficult breakup, then recommending a specific counselor, one who, I now realized with horror, might have been feeding her information. How deep does this go? I whispered. We're still discovering that. The investigation has expanded significantly since the arrests. Westridge Pharmaceuticals is attempting to distance itself from the conspiracy, claiming a few rogue employees acted without corporate knowledge. We don't believe that for a second. My phone buzzed again, another text from Mara, no pressure. Just know I'm here if you need someone to talk to who isn't in the middle of all this. Maybe that was exactly what I needed, someone adjacent to my life but not central to it. Someone who knew me well enough to understand but wasn't enmeshed in the Calloway drama. I think I'll meet her, I decided. Public place, daytime, nothing too intense. My father smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. Good. Small steps back into the world. That's how we rebuild. Later that evening, I sat with my mother in the kitchen as she prepared a simple dinner. The normality of the activity, chopping vegetables, measuring spices, provided a strange comfort after days of chaos. I've been thinking about what that reporter said, my mother said, hands steady as she diced an onion. About your father using you as bait. I looked up from the lettuce I was washing. It wasn't like that. No, it wasn't. But there's something important there, about the different kinds of protection we offer the people we love. She set down her knife, turning to face me fully. Your father protected you the way he knows how, through investigation, through vigilance, through strategic patience. I sometimes wonder if I failed you by not protecting you differently. What do you mean? She sighed, picking up a towel to dry her hands. I saw things too, Eliza. Small things. The way Xavier would redirect conversations when certain topics came up. How he always seemed to position himself between you and your father at family gatherings. How Nina suddenly became his champion after years of barely tolerating your previous boyfriends. I stared at her, surprised. You never said anything. No, I didn't. I told myself I was respecting your autonomy, not interfering in your relationship. She shook her head. But perhaps I should have asked more questions, even at the risk of seeming intrusive. There's protection in questions too, in creating space for doubt before certainty calcifies. Her words resonated with something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. My father had protected me through investigation, through gathering evidence, through strategic planning. But there was another kind of protection my mother might have offered, the protection of perspective, of gentle questioning, of introducing uncertainty where I had been too certain. It's not your fault, I said finally. Xavier fooled professionals, security experts, background checks. He was trained for this. Perhaps. She returned to her chopping, the rhythmic sound filling the kitchen. But mothers have different instincts than security experts. I knew something was wrong in my gut. But I doubted myself because everyone else seemed so convinced. The parallel to my own experience was unmistakable. I too had felt things that didn't align with Xavier's perfect presentation, had noticed discrepancies I quickly dismissed. We had both overridden our instincts in favor of more rational explanations. Trust your gut, my mother said, as if reading my thoughts. It's processing information your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. The next morning, I met Mara at a small cafe in town, choosing a table at the back where we could talk without being overheard. She arrived precisely on time, dressed in business casual that suggested she'd scheduled our meeting before her workday began. Eliza, she said simply, giving me a quick hug before sitting down. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I wasn't sure you would. I studied her face, looking for signs of the journalist seeking a scoop. Instead, I saw only the friend I'd shared midnight study sessions and 21st birthday celebrations with. I wasn't sure either, I admitted. But I think I need to Talk to someone who knew me before all this. She nodded, understanding immediately. Before you became a headline. Before your identity got wrapped up in this awful thing that happened to you. Exactly. I felt a small release of tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. Everyone keeps asking how I didn't know, how I didn't see it coming. But you knew me then. I wasn't naive or desperate or blind. I was just trusting, she supplied. You always were. Not foolishly, just fundamentally decent. You assumed others operated with the same basic integrity you did. The description hit something true. I had approached relationships with an assumption of good faith, not blind trust, but a baseline belief that people were generally what they presented themselves to be. Xavier shattered that, I said quietly. Not just the trust in him specifically, but in my ability to judge character at all. Mara reached across the table, covering my hand with hers. One person's extraordinary deception doesn't negate your lifetime of sound judgments. Think about it, how many people have you correctly assessed over the years? How many friendships and working relationships have proven genuine? I hadn't considered that perspective. My focus had been so narrowly on where my judgment had failed that I'd ignored all the evidence of where it had served me well. Including you, I said, managing a small smile. I always knew you'd be a successful journalist. You asked better questions than our professors even in freshman year. She laughed, the sound bringing back memories of late nights in our dorm room, planning futures that seemed both impossible and inevitable. And I knew you'd do something that combined your analytical mind with your compassion. The bioethics division at Callaway fits you perfectly. Our conversation continued, moving from the past to the present, touching on the case only briefly. Mara didn't press for details beyond what I volunteered, true to her promise to wear only her friend hat today. As we were finishing our coffee, she hesitated, then said, "There's something I should tell you. I've been offered the chance to write a feature on corporate espionage, using the Westridge Callaway situation as the central case study." I tensed immediately. "Mara, I haven't accepted," she said quickly. "And I won't, if you object. Our friendship matters more than any article." I considered her words, weighing the competing concerns. On one hand, the story would be told by someone else if not by Mara, someone without personal connection, someone perhaps less careful with the human elements. On the other hand, could our friendship survive her professional examination of the most painful chapter of my life? What would it involve? I asked finally. Research into Westridge's history of acquisition attempts. Analysis of corporate espionage tactics. Legal experts on trust law and inheritance structures. She paused. And yes, some personal elements of the story. But always focused on the broader implications, not sensationalism. Would you need to interview me? Ideally, yes. But with clear boundaries we established together. And you'd have approval rights on any direct quotes. I took a deep breath, surprised to find myself even considering it. But perhaps there was value in shaping the narrative rather than simply reacting to it. Perhaps working with someone I trusted could help transform this experience from something that happened to me into something I actively processed and shared on my own terms. Let me think about it, I said finally. It's not an automatic no, but I need time. Mara nodded, relief visible in her expression. Of course. Take all the time you need. And Eliza? Thank you for trusting me enough to even consider it. As I drove home from the cafe, I reflected on our conversation. The simple act of connecting with someone from my pre-Xavier life had shifted something inside me, had reminded me that my identity extended far beyond the bride who survived. I had a history, friendships, professional accomplishments, and a future that belonged entirely to me. The betrayal would always be part of my story. But it didn't have to be the defining chapter. Back at home, I found my father in his study, on the phone with the Callaway Biotech legal team. 9 years of pretended disability had not diminished his command of the company. If anything, his forced observation period had given him insights that might have escaped a more active CEO. He ended the call when I entered, raising an eyebrow in question. It was good, I said, answering his unspoken query about the meeting with Mara. Reconnecting with someone who knew me before helps. Reminds me I'm still the same person. But changed, he noted. Changed, yes. But not fundamentally altered. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where I'd sat countless times during his paralysis years. We are who we've always been, just with new awareness. He nodded slowly. That's a healthy perspective. One I'm still working toward myself. What do you mean? He gestured to his legs, to the empty space where his wheelchair had been for 9 years. I'm relearning how to move through the world as a whole person again. Not just physically, but socially, professionally. For nearly a decade, I filtered everything through the lens of my supposed disability. Now I have to recalibrate. I hadn't considered his transition back to mobility from that angle, the psychological adjustment after years of a double life. While I was grappling with betrayal, he was navigating his own complex reintegration. We're all healing in different ways, I observed. Yes, he agreed. And that's what they never understood, Xavier, Nina, Westridge. They saw us as obstacles, as targets, as means to an end. What they missed is that the Callaway resilience isn't just in our legal structures or our corporate governance. It's in our capacity to adapt, to recover, to transform pain into purpose. His words resonated with something taking shape in my own thoughts, a growing determination to find meaning in this experience, to use it as a catalyst rather than allowing it to become a permanent wound. Mara wants to write a feature article, I said, about corporate espionage, using our case as the centerpiece. My father's expression remained neutral. And how do you feel about that? Uncertain. But considering it. I explained the parameters. Mara had outlined the focus on corporate tactics rather than personal drama. It could be valuable, he said thoughtfully, to frame this as what it was, a business crime, not just a personal betrayal. To help others recognize similar patterns before they progress as far as ours did. That's what I was thinking. Transform this from something that happened to me into something I'm actively addressing, maybe even preventing for others. He smiled, a genuine expression that reminded me of childhood moments when he'd been particularly proud of some accomplishment. That's the Callaway way. Turn setbacks into stepping stones. As I left his study, I felt a subtle shift in my perspective, from victim to advocate, from target to teacher. The road ahead would still be difficult, the legal proceedings lengthy, the emotional processing ongoing. But for the first time since discovering Xavier's betrayal, I could envision a future where this experience strengthened rather than diminished me. In the hallway, I passed the family photos that lined the wall, generations of Callaways standing tall against various backdrops. Soon, there would be a new portrait, my father standing again after 9 years, my mother beside him, me with eyes more knowing than before. Not broken by betrayal, but tempered by it. Not defined by deception, but refined through its discovery. Have you ever found strength in the very experience designed to destroy you? Have you transformed betrayal into wisdom, pain into perspective? The journey isn't linear or simple, but each step taken with intention moves you forward. And sometimes, the path created by those who meant you harm leads instead to a place of greater power than they could have imagined. 6 months after my almost wedding, I stood in the courtroom as the jury forewoman read the verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Xavier James Porter, guilty. Her voice remained steady. As she continued through the list of charges, attempted poisoning, fraud, corporate espionage. Guilty on all counts. When she read the same verdicts for Nina, my cousin didn't look up, her gaze fixed on her clasped hands. I felt no surge of triumph, no wave of vindication, just a quiet settling, like dust finally coming to rest after a long disturbance. Beside me, my father reached for my hand, squeezing it 3 times. I'm with you. Our private code since childhood. Now weighted with new meaning after everything we'd endured. The court thanks the jury for their service, the judge announced. Sentencing will be scheduled for 4 weeks from today. The defendants are remanded to custody. As Xavier was led away in handcuffs, he turned toward me, one last attempt to make eye contact, perhaps to gauge his impact, to see if he still held any power over me. I met his gaze directly, my expression neither angry nor afraid. Just present. Aware. Unmoved by whatever manipulation he might attempt. For a moment, something like confusion crossed his face. He'd expected hatred, perhaps, or lingering attachment, some emotional response he could use or understand. My calm neutrality seemed to unsettle him more than rage would have. He'd lost not just his freedom, but his relevance to my life. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered on the steps, microphones extended like probing fingers. My family's attorney had advised us to offer only brief comments, to save substantive statements for after sentencing. But as we emerged into the bright autumn sunlight, I felt the need to speak, not for the cameras or the headlines, but for myself. Miss Callaway, how do you feel about the verdict? Called a reporter from the front of the crowd. I paused on the courthouse steps. Justice was served today, but this case reveals vulnerabilities that extend far beyond my family. Corporate espionage has become increasingly personal and dangerous. The legal system addressed the criminal conspiracy, but we all need to examine the corporate cultures that enable and reward such extreme tactics. Another reporter pushed forward. Will you be pursuing civil action against Westridge Pharmaceuticals? That matter is still under consideration, my father interjected smoothly. Today's verdict confirms the criminal nature of actions taken by individuals employed by Westridge. The extent of corporate knowledge and involvement remains under investigation. We continued down the steps, declining further questions. Our car waited at the curb, the driver holding the door open with practiced discretion. Once inside, protected by tinted windows, my mother released a long breath. "It's over," she said softly. "At least this part." "The criminal case," my father clarified. "The civil litigation is just beginning. And the corporate restructuring to prevent anything like this from happening again." I leaned back against the leather seat, watching the courthouse recede through the rear window. "It's not really over for any of us," I said. "But it's changing shape. Becoming something we can build from rather than just survive." The past 6 months had transformed all our lives in ways both obvious and subtle. My father had returned to his role as CEO of Callaway Biotech, his miraculous recovery explained through carefully crafted press releases that emphasized experimental treatments and gradual improvement. The truth, that he had regained significant mobility years earlier but maintained the pretense of paralysis while investigating corporate espionage, remained known only to family, close associates, and law enforcement. I had taken a leave of absence from my position in the bioethics division, using the time to collaborate with Mara on her feature article about corporate espionage. What began as a single piece expanded into a series, examining not just the Callaway case but similar incidents across the pharmaceutical industry. The work gave me purpose, transforming my personal trauma into professional advocacy. My mother had channeled her energy into strengthening the family foundation, creating a new initiative focused on ethics in corporate governance. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, that our family's worst experience was generating positive change in the very industry that had targeted us. At home, I retreated to my temporary office, a converted sunroom where I'd set up shop during my leave of absence. Mara's final article in the series was scheduled for publication next week, and I'd promised to review the galleys today. The headline made me pause: "From Victim to Vigilance, How One Family's Tragedy is Reforming Corporate Ethics." The piece detailed not just what had happened to us, but what we were doing with that experience, the policy changes my father had implemented at Callaway Biotech, the whistleblower protections, the ethics training now required for all employees. It outlined my mother's foundation work and my own emerging role as an advocate for corporate transparency. My phone rang, Detective Rivera, whose life had become as intertwined with ours as any family friend. "The DA wants to discuss sentencing recommendations," he said without preamble. "They're particularly interested in your perspective on Nina. Her attorney is suggesting that she was coerced by Xavier, that she deserves leniency." I considered this carefully. In the months since the arrests, evidence had indeed suggested that Nina's involvement had evolved gradually, beginning with small betrayals that Xavier normalized, then escalated to more serious crimes. The psychological manipulation was documented in text messages, in recordings, in testimony from others who had observed their relationship. "What does the evidence suggest?" I asked. "That she was a willing participant who knew exactly what she was doing," Rivera replied bluntly. "But also that Xavier selected her specifically because of her vulnerabilities, her financial struggles, her history of being compared unfavorably to you, her chemistry knowledge. He groomed her, essentially." The word "groomed" sent a chill through me. Nina was 4 years younger than me, had always lived somewhat in my shadow according to family dynamics I hadn't created but had benefited from. Had Xavier recognized that weakness and exploited it? Undoubtedly. Did that excuse her participation in a plot to murder me? No. "I'll need to think about this," I told Rivera. "Can I call you tomorrow?" "Of course." This isn't an easy call. After we hung up, I gazed out at the garden where late autumn flowers still bloomed in defiance of the cooling temperatures. The question of Nina's sentencing recommendation brought me to a crossroads I hadn't anticipated, a moment where justice and mercy sat in uneasy proximity, asking me to weigh their relative values. Xavier deserved the maximum sentence, on that, I had no doubt. His calculation, his years of deception, his central role in orchestrating not just my near death but my father's accident years earlier, these warranted the fullest punishment available. But Nina's case felt different in ways I was still processing. My father found me there an hour later, still contemplating the garden and the complex question of appropriate consequences. "Thinking about Nina?" he asked, settling into the chair opposite mine. I looked at him, unsurprised by his intuition. Rivera called. "The DA wants my input on sentencing recommendations." He nodded. "I received the same call. It's a difficult position to be in, determining the appropriate punishment for someone who was both perpetrator and, in some ways, victim herself." "What would you do?" I asked. "If it were solely your decision?" My father considered this, his expression thoughtful. I would recognize that the harshest possible sentence might satisfy a desire for retribution, but wouldn't necessarily serve justice in its fullest sense. Nina made terrible choices, but she did so under the influence of someone who had studied manipulation professionally and applied those skills with precision. So you think she deserves leniency? I think she deserves consequences proportional to her actions, which include accountability for her choices but also recognition of the context in which those choices were made. He leaned forward slightly. The question isn't just what she deserves, Eliza. It's also what kind of person you want to be in response to what happened. His words resonated with something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. This wasn't only about Nina's future, it was about mine. About whether I would allow this experience to harden me into someone defined by the harm others had attempted, or whether I could maintain the compassion that had always been fundamental to my character. I don't want to be driven by revenge, I said slowly. But I also don't want to minimize what she did because of our family connection or because Xavier manipulated her. Then find the middle path, my father suggested. Advocate for serious consequences that reflect the gravity of her actions, but not the maximum possible punishment. Allow for the possibility of redemption without guaranteeing it. Later that evening, I called Aunt Patricia. Our relationship had been strained since Nina's arrest, unavoidable given the circumstances. But in recent months, we'd begun cautiously rebuilding, acknowledging the pain on both sides without letting it define our entire connection. Eliza, she answered, her voice carrying the permanent weariness that had settled in since her daughter's arrest. Is everything all right? Yes, I assured her. I wanted to let you know that the DA has asked for my input on Nina's sentencing recommendation. A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I see. I haven't decided what I'll say yet, I continued. But I wanted you to know that I'm thinking carefully about it. That I recognize the complexity of her situation. Thank you, she whispered. I know we have no right to ask anything of you, after what she did. But she wasn't always this person. Xavier changed her, twisted her into someone we didn't recognize. I know, I said softly. I remember who she was before. And I know she made her own choices, but also that those choices were made under extreme manipulation. We talked for nearly an hour, the longest conversation we'd had since before the wedding. Aunt Patricia shared details I hadn't known about Nina's deteriorating mental health in the years after college, about financial pressures that had made her vulnerable to Xavier's influence, about subtle changes in her behavior that, in retrospect, signaled her involvement in something dangerous. By the time we said goodbye, I had a clearer picture of the cousin I'd grown up with, not excused from responsibility, but understood with greater dimension than before. The next morning, I called Rivera with my decision. I want to recommend substantial prison time, enough to reflect the seriousness of attempting murder, but with possibility for early release based on genuine rehabilitation, I told him. And I want to request that any sentence include mandatory psychiatric treatment. You're sure? He asked. No one would blame you for seeking maximum penalties. I'm sure, I replied. This isn't about forgiveness. It's about proportional justice that leaves room for change. 2 days later, I received an unexpected request. Nina wanted to meet with me, not through her attorney, not as part of any legal strategy, but personally. My first instinct was refusal. What could she possibly say that would matter now? But after consideration, I agreed to a supervised meeting at the detention center. The visiting room was stark and institutional, beige walls, simple furniture bolted to the floor, guards positioned discreetly but visibly at the entrance. Nina entered in her orange jumpsuit, thinner than I remembered, her once confident posture now hunched slightly inward. Thank you for coming, she said as she sat across from me, hands folded on the table between us. I didn't expect you would. I almost didn't, I replied honestly. She nodded, accepting this. I know nothing I say can undo what I did. Or even adequately explain it. She took a deep breath. But I needed to tell you directly that I take full responsibility for my actions. Regardless of Xavier's influence, I made choices that could have killed you. That would have killed you, if you hadn't been smarter than both of us. Her directness surprised me. I had expected excuses, perhaps, or emotional manipulation. This straightforward acknowledgement was unexpected. Why did you do it? I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. We grew up together, Nina. We were family. She didn't answer immediately, seeming to search for words that wouldn't sound like justification. It started small, she finally said. Xavier approached me at a chemistry conference 3 years ago. He knew who I was, knew about our family connection. He said he was interested in me professionally, that my research on biochemical compounds was impressive. She described how the relationship had evolved, professional interest becoming personal attention, then gradually shifting toward conversations about the Calloway family dynamics, about the trust structure, about her feelings of being overshadowed. He made me feel seen in ways I never had been, she admitted. Valued for exactly the qualities that had always made me different from you, my interest in chemistry over business, my directness over your diplomacy. He reframed my resentments as righteous anger, my jealousy as justified response to unfair treatment. And that justified murder? I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. No, she said quickly. Nothing justifies that. But it wasn't presented as murder, not at first. It was just information gathering, then small acts of deception, then financial maneuvers. Each step normalized the next, made the escalation seem logical. She described how Xavier had introduced the poisoning plan only after years of grooming, presenting it as a regrettable necessity for a greater good, corporate restructuring. That would supposedly benefit more people than it harmed. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Nina concluded. I don't deserve that, and I know it. I just wanted you to understand that while I take full responsibility for my actions, the person who did those things isn't who I always was, or who I hope to be again someday. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. I found none, just exhaustion, regret, and a clear-eyed acceptance of consequences. I don't forgive you, I said finally. But I do believe in the possibility of redemption. What you do with your time in prison, how you use that experience to reshape yourself, that will determine whether we ever have any kind of relationship again. She nodded, not pushing for more than I could give. That's more than I had any right to expect. As I left the detention center, I felt a curious lightness, not from forgiveness or closure, but from the clarity of boundaries firmly established. I had neither absolved Nina nor condemned her to permanent exile from my life. I had simply stated the truth as it stood now, while leaving space for evolution. The week of sentencing arrived with a flurry of legal activity. Xavier received the maximum sentence, 30 years without possibility of parole, with additional charges pending for his role in my father's accident 9 years earlier. Nina received 15 years with possibility of parole after 8, contingent upon completion of rehabilitation programs and psychiatric treatment. As the judge read Nina's sentence, I watched Aunt Patricia in the row ahead of me, her shoulders shaking slightly with silent tears. Despite everything, she was still a mother losing her daughter to prison. The human connections remained, complicated and painful though they were. Outside the courthouse, after the final hearing, I found myself face to face with Uncle Richard for the first time since the sentencing. He looked older, grayer, the events of the past months etched into the lines around his eyes. Eliza, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I want to thank you. For what? For your recommendation to the DA. Patricia told me you could have pushed for the maximum sentence for Nina. That you didn't, it means something to us, even in the middle of all this. I nodded, unsure what to say. We stood in awkward silence for a moment before he spoke again. I keep thinking about family gatherings when you girls were small. How you would always include Nina in your games even when the other cousins found her too serious, too different. You were kind then. And you found a way to be kind now, even after what she did. It wasn't kindness, I clarified. It was justice as I see it. Nina deserves serious consequences, but also the chance to rebuild herself. He nodded, accepting this distinction. Either way, thank you. That night, back at home, I sat with my parents in the living room, the fire crackling gently in the hearth. The formal legal proceedings were complete, though civil litigation against Westridge would continue for months or years. There was a sense of one chapter closing, another beginning. I've been thinking about returning to work, I said, breaking the comfortable silence. Not to my old position, but to something new. My father raised an eyebrow in question. Mara's articles have generated significant interest in corporate ethics reform, I explained. Several industry groups have approached me about consulting on transparency initiatives, whistleblower protections, that sort of thing. Using your experience to prevent similar situations, my mother observed. Exactly. Transforming what happened from just a personal trauma into something constructive. I leaned forward, warming my hands by the fire. And I've been thinking about the trust structure too, how its outdated provisions made me a target. I want to work with our attorneys to reform it, to ensure it can't be exploited that way again. My father nodded approvingly. From potential victim to active reformer. That's the legacy I'd hoped you'd find in all this. It's not what I would have chosen, I admitted. But since it happened, I want it to mean something beyond personal survival. It already does, my mother said softly. You've shown remarkable strength, Eliza. Not just in surviving their plot, but in how you've handled everything since the media attention, the legal proceedings, the family fallout. You've maintained your integrity throughout. I thought about that word, integrity. wholeness. The quality of being undivided against yourself. Despite everything that had happened, I had managed to remain true to my core values, to make decisions aligned with who I wanted to be rather than reactive to what others had done. I've been offered a book deal, I said, watching their expressions carefully. Not a sensationalized account, but a serious examination of corporate ethics, using our case as the central example. The proceeds would go to a foundation supporting victims of similar crimes. You should do it, my father said without hesitation. Your perspective is unique, you understand both the personal and institutional dimensions of what happened. I'm considering it, I replied. But I wanted to be sure you both felt comfortable with me sharing our story more widely. My mother reached over to take my hand. The story is already out there, Eliza. Better to have it told thoughtfully, with purpose, than left to tabloid speculation. The fire popped and shifted, sending up a shower of sparks that quickly faded. Outside, snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, transforming the landscape with quiet persistence. I never expected to become an advocate, I mused. It wasn't in my carefully planned life trajectory. The most meaningful paths rarely are, my father replied. They emerge from disruption, from the moments that break our expected narratives and force us to create new ones. 1 year to the day after my almost wedding, I stood at a podium in the Callaway Biotech Conference Center, addressing the inaugural meeting of the Corporate Ethics Consortium, an industry initiative born from the public response to Mara's articles and my subsequent advocacy. Transformation doesn't erase trauma, I told the assembled executives, attorneys, and ethics officers. It builds from it. The same factors that made me a target, my position in the family business, my trusting nature, my heart condition, have become sources of insight and authority in advocating for change. I outlined the reforms already implemented at Callaway Biotech, the enhanced security protocols, the ethics training, the protected channels for reporting concerns. I described similar initiatives now underway at other companies, including, ironically, Westridge Pharmaceuticals, which had undergone significant leadership changes following the civil settlement. The systems that enabled my near destruction have been reconfigured to ensure greater protection for others, I concluded. Not perfect protection, no system can guarantee that, but structural safeguards that make similar conspiracies harder to execute and easier to detect. After the presentation, as attendees networked over coffee, my father joined me near the windows overlooking the city. In the year since he had officially regained his mobility, he had adjusted to moving through the world without the wheelchair that had been both his constraint and his camouflage. His posture was straighter now, his movements more confident. Your grandfather would be proud, he said, nodding toward the crowd of industry leaders now engaged in serious discussions about ethics reform. He built this company on principles of integrity when those were seen as optional in the industry. You're carrying that forward in ways he couldn't have imagined. I smiled, watching the animated conversations unfolding across the room. From collapsed bride to ethics crusader. Not the transformation I expected. The most powerful changes never are, my father replied. They arise not from our careful plans but from how we respond when those plans are shattered. Later that evening, I returned to my new apartment, a place with no memories of Xavier, no associations with the life I'd planned with him. The space was entirely mine, decorated according to my actual preferences rather than the curated tastes I'd adopted during our relationship. On my desk sat the first printed copy of my book, delivered by courier that afternoon. The cover was simple but striking, a wedding cake with a barely visible crack running through it, the title embossed in silver, Trust Structures, Corporate Ethics and Personal Betrayal. I ran my fingers over the embossed letters, feeling a sense of completion, not of the journey itself, which continued to unfold in unexpected ways, but of its initial chapter. The book represented my reclamation of the narrative, my transformation of private pain into public purpose. My phone chimed with a text from Mara, congratulations on the book and the consortium launch. From victim to visionary in 1 year. If that's not resilience, I don't know what is. I smiled at her characterization. Resilience. The capacity to recover from difficulties, to regain shape after being compressed, to find strength in the very experience designed to destroy you. The path forward wasn't perfectly clear, healing rarely follows a linear trajectory. There would still be difficult days, moments when trust felt impossible, when memories ambushed me with their intensity. But increasingly, those moments were balanced by a sense of purpose that transcended the personal. The wedding that never happened had become the catalyst for change that might never have occurred otherwise. The poison intended to end my life had instead transformed it. The conspiracy meant to erase me had ultimately revealed me, to myself and to a world now listening to what I had to say. Have you ever discovered unexpected strength in your most difficult experiences? Have you found purpose in pain, wisdom in betrayal, direction and disruption? The journey through trauma isn't one anyone would choose, but the path that emerges on the other side can lead to places more meaningful than those on your original map. Sometimes the moments meant to destroy us become the very foundations upon which we build our most authentic lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.